We live in an age of absolute visibility, where satellites map every square meter of our home. Yet, deep in our collective psyche, we refuse to accept that the global map is truly finished. We cling to the hope that in the white, silent corners of the world, something ancient survives. Today, we look at the Yeti not as a campfire ghost story, but as a scientific obsession. This isn't just about footprints in the snow. It's about the Soviet Union searching for a biological weapon. It's about Hollywood stars smuggling bones and the most expensive DNA tests in history. But before we dissect the genetics, we must understand the sheer scale of the hunt. In 1958, the USSR Academy of Sciences did something that seems impossible to the modern mind. They officially formed a state-backed commission to hunt down the snowman in the brutal Pamir Mountains. This wasn't a hobbyist club, it was a military-grade operation with botanists, handlers, and top search dogs. Their mission was cold and specific: catch the creature, study it, or bring back a body. The leading theory came from Professor Boris Porshnev, who argued these weren't spirits, but relic hominids. He believed Neanderthals hadn't died out, but had retreated into the harshest, darkest altitudes to survive us. Imagine the ideological victory of finding a living missing link that breathes, eats, and walks upright. It would be a triumph of materialism, proving evolution so loudly it would drown out every other belief. But the expedition team found themselves in a landscape that destroys the human mind. At these altitudes, oxygen starvation makes the brain misfire, turning shadows into monsters. Hardened dogs refused to track, whining and tucking their tails at scents they couldn't understand. Locals spoke of wild people who tore strangers apart, while strange, loud cries echoed at night. Yet, despite the footprints and the fear, the Soviet team returned with empty hands and blurred photos. Science offers a cold explanation for these failures: the fragile limits of the human machine. In extreme isolation and oxygen deprivation, the starving brain, desperate for meaning, creates pareidolia. A cracking branch becomes a heavy footstep. A shadow on a rock becomes a hunched giant. When fear grips a group, one person's hallucination can infect the others instantly, creating a shared reality. But while the Soviets found nothing but ghosts, a monastery in Nepal claimed to hold physical proof. In the remote village of Pangboshe, monks guarded a sacred relic wrapped in silk for centuries. It was a withered, blackened hand too large for a human, yet too dexterous for a bear. Enter Peter Byrne, a researcher who saw this not as a holy object, but as scientific gold. He offered a fortune for the hand, but the monks refused, fearing a curse upon the valley. So Byrne decided that if he couldn't buy it, he would have to steal it. He recruited an unlikely accomplice, Hollywood legend James Stewart, who was vacationing in India. Together, they devised a plan that sounds like it was written for a heist movie. Byrne created a crude replica using human bones and waited for a festival distraction. In a moment of sleight of hand, the sacred relic was swapped for the fake. But smuggling a monster's hand out of Nepal required a specific, clever kind of cover. James Stewart hid the severed finger in his wife's luggage, right inside a box of lingerie. They bet on the fact that customs officers would be too embarrassed to rummage through a lady's underwear. The gamble worked, and the Yeti hand arrived in London to a media frenzy. For decades, cryptozoologists hailed it as proof of a cliff-climbing predator that could tear prey apart. But in 2011, modern science finally caught up with the stolen bone. The DNA verdict was absolute and unromantic. The bone was human. The hand was a ritual composite human bone wrapped in animal skin and preserved with fat. The monks weren't fraudsters. They were building a spiritual symbol, not a biological exhibit. But while the hand was constructed, the story of Zana feels uncomfortably real. We traveled to the dense forests of Abkhazia in the late 19th century. Local hunters cornered something they had tracked for weeks in the deep woods. It stood on two legs, looked like a woman, but fought with the fury of a beast. She was 2 meters tall, covered in thick, dark hair, with a massive, muscular torso. It took multiple men to bind her and drag her back to the village. They named her Zana and threw her into a pit lined with sharpened stakes. She tore raw meat apart with her hands and shredded any clothing offered to her. Years passed, and though she was tamed enough to roam, she dug burrows to sleep in winter. Her strength was terrifying. She could carry 80 kilograms uphill faster than a horse. She swam across flooding rivers that would drown an experienced swimmer in seconds. But her story turns from a creature feature into a deep human tragedy. Zana was exploited by the local men, eventually bearing several children who survived. Decades later, researchers looked at the descriptions of her skull and thought, Neanderthal. It fit the profile perfectly: the brow ridge, the heavy jaw, the inability to speak. Once again, modern genetics stepped in, testing saliva from her living descendants. The answer didn't rewrite evolution, but it revealed a dark and sorrowful chapter of history. Zana was fully human, her DNA tracing back to sub-Saharan Africa. She was likely a victim of the Ottoman slave trade, abandoned or escaped, surviving alone in the wild. Her monster status was a tragic mix of isolation, genetic variation, and human cruelty. We wanted a Yeti. We found a lost woman treated like an animal because she was different. But while Zana's story is a tragedy of the past, one piece of footage refuses to die. October 20th, 1967, Bluff Creek, California. Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin are riding horses through a quiet, sunlit forest. Suddenly, the horses panic, rearing up at a scent that screams predator. Patterson falls, grabs his camera, and runs toward a massive figure walking along the creek. What he captured is the holy grail of cryptozoology, the Patterson-Gimlin film. A large, hair-covered figure walks away, not with the panic of a bear, but with arrogant calm. Then, at frame 352, it turns its head to look directly into the lens. That look, cold, assessing, unafraid, has kept believers awake for decades. This wasn't a blurry shadow, it was a clear, daylight shot of a biological entity. Skeptics immediately called it a man in a suit, but Hollywood experts paused. In 1967, ape suits were stiff and obvious, yet this creature's muscles seemed to ripple under the skin. It had visible breasts, suggesting a female, a strange detail for a hoaxer to include. The gait was smooth and bent-kneed, lacking the head bob typical of a human walking in heavy costume. For years, biomechanics experts argued that a human couldn't move like that without training. It seemed we finally had our proof, a relic hominid walking in the American backyard. But time and technology are cruel to mysteries. Modern stabilization removed the camera shake that hid the flaws. As the image cleared, the magic began to crack, and what looked like muscle started to look like padding. Biomechanics experts showed that a human could indeed mimic that gait with enough practice and heavy shoes. Then came the damaging confession. A local man claimed he wore a suit stitched from horsehide and pads. He described a mask that limited his vision, forcing him to turn his entire body to look around exactly like the film. So why did we believe so intensely? Because our brains are wired to find patterns in the noise. The uncanny valley works in both directions. We project soul and intention into a rubber mask because we want it to be real. Patterson took his secret to the grave, leaving us with a cultural icon, but no biological proof. However, legends rarely come from nothing, and while films can be faked, fossils are much harder to forge. In 1935, a German paleontologist named Gustav von Königswald walked into a traditional apothecary in Hong Kong. He wasn't looking for a cure, he was hunting for dragon bones, fossils being ground up for medicine. Deep in a drawer of dusty remedies, he pulled out a molar that made his blood run cold. It looked human in structure, but it was massive, 2 or 3 times the size of a man's molar. This wasn't a dragon, and it wasn't a person, it was a primate unknown to science. He named it Gigantopithecus, the giant ape, a real monster that once walked the earth. Reconstructions painted a terrifying picture, a creature 3 meters tall, weighing up to half a ton. Imagine a gorilla scaled up to nightmare proportions, capable of snapping thick branches like matchsticks. For Yeti believers, the puzzle pieces finally clicked into place with a satisfying snap. We know this giant lived in Asia. What if it didn't die out fully 300,000 years ago? What if a remnant population retreated higher into the Himalayas to escape climate change, and us? It sounds perfect, but biology is an unforgiving accountant when it comes to energy. Being a giant is expensive. A massive primate engine needs massive amounts of fuel to run. Estimates suggest a living Gigantopithecus would need 50 kilograms of food every single day. In a lush tropical forest, that is possible. On a frozen Himalayan ridge, it is a death sentence. Isotope analysis revealed they were specialized eaters who couldn't adapt when the forests retreated. We didn't drive them into secret mountain caves. We, along with the shifting climate, drove them into extinction. Gigantopithecus isn't hiding in the snow, it is sediment now, sleeping in the rock. Yet, the belief persisted, preserved in tufts of hair stored like holy relics in private collections. In 2014, Oxford University decided to end the debate with a definitive genetic audit. Professor Brian Sykes issued a global challenge to the cryptozoology community. Send me everything. For researchers who had been mocked for decades, this was their judgment day. Packages arrived from the Russian tiger, the US, and Bhutan, over 30 specimens claiming to be proof. The stakes were dizzying. A single DNA match to an unknown primate would guarantee a Nobel Prize. Some even hoped for a human hybrid signal, a genetic echo that would validate the Xenostories. The results were published in the Royal Society proceedings, and for believers, it was a cold shower. Science dismantled the monsters one by one with clinical, unfeeling precision. What was thought to be a beast was a horse, another sample was a raccoon, a third was a cow. One famous Yeti hair turned out to be a strand of synthetic fiberglass insulation. The rest were wolves, dogs, and tapirs, a parade of wishful thinking and misidentification. But in the pile of disappointments, 2 samples from the Himalayas refused to fit the pattern. These samples matched the DNA of an ancient polar bear that lived 40,000 years ago. This suggests that the high Himalayas might hide a rare, hybrid bear lineage unknown to textbooks. It wouldn't be a magical man-ape, but a biological paradox. A polar bear adapting to mountain rock. Imagine an animal with lighter fur, aggressive behavior, and a genetic memory of the Ice Age. And bears do one thing that can birth a legend in a single heartbeat. They stand up. In a blinding snowstorm, through the haze of oxygen deprivation, a standing bear is a giant man. Its arms hang low, its head sits high. It looks at you with intelligent, predatory eyes. In that terrifying moment, the brain doesn't do taxonomy. It screams monster and tells you to run. So the legend didn't come from nothing. It came from a real encounter with a stranger in the dark. We have traveled a long, strange road in search of this shadow. We walked with Soviet generals who dreamed of capturing a living biological weapon. We watched monks turn bone and skin into holy objects to protect their valley from misfortune. We pitied Xana, the woman whose difference made her a prisoner of human cruelty. We stared into the grainy eyes of the Patterson film, desperate to believe in the impossible. And we held the heavy, fossilized teeth of giant apes that time has turned to stone. So we must ask the final question. Why did the Yetis vanish? They didn't vanish because they died out. They vanished because we changed. We live in an era of autofocus reality, of GPS, drones, and thermal imaging. Myths thrive in the blur, in the shadows, in the low-resolution corners of the map. As our world became clearer, the room for wonder became smaller. So the Yetis retreated to the only place where they could truly survive: the human mind. We desperately need to believe that beyond the next ridge, deep in the dark trees, something wild remains. We need the world to be bigger, stranger, and more dangerous than our satellites say it is. But in a strange way, perhaps that something is still out there, waiting in the ice. Somewhere on the screaming Himalayan peaks, that ancient bear lineage may still roam. It is huge, fierce, and carries the genetic memory of a time before humans conquered the Earth. It does not care about our myths, our movies, our grainy photos, or our DNA tests. And believe this, meeting it alone on a narrow trail would be a primal terror. With your flashlight dying and nowhere to run, the specific taxonomy of the beast won't matter, because reality, with all its teeth and claws, can bite much harder than any myth. Perhaps the search for the Yeti was never really about finding a monster. It was about looking into the mirror of nature and hoping to see a brother looking back. We looked for a wild man and found only our own reflection, hopeful, fearful, and terribly lonely. The mountains might be empty of giant apes, but they are full of silence. And in that silence, the mystery survives, safe from our cameras and our skepticism. So keep looking, keep questioning, and never let the map be fully finished. Because a world without monsters is a world without magic. And honestly, That is a place none of us want to live in. The truth is not just in the bones we find, but in the stories we refuse to let go. Thank you for watching.